The 9th chapter of John contains an incident and a description of the events around it that is astonishing, to say the least. It's difficult for me to imagine why it happened, why people ask some of the questions they ask, and maybe a little historical perspective will help us to understand these events. As Jesus passed by, verse 1 of chapter 9 of John, the Gospel according to John, his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now the question falls strangely on our ears, because I don't think most people today think of blindness or crippled situation or things like this as a direct sin handicap consequence. A lot of things happen to us in our society out of sheer bad luck. It's the roll of the dice. The genetic code gets rolled and we come up as a loser. Or we're driving along at an intersection somewhere, an earthquake happens and something falls down in front of us, our car crashes into it, and we're crippled for life. It's an accident. It's not something. We don't normally in our world think this way. But you should understand that among Jews of this time, and in this circumstance, in this place, it was common to think in terms of a direct connection between prosperity and righteousness, and, on the other hand, poverty and unrighteousness. That a wealthy man, for example, was presumed to be a righteous man. Because, after all, the blessings of the Lord are upon the righteous, right? And the curses of the Lord are upon the unrighteous. And therefore, the man who is obviously blessed, he is healthy, he is wealthy, his life is working fine for him. The presumption, as you look at him, he must be a righteous man because God has blessed him. And here's a poor guy over here who is poor, he's sick, he's blind, and so forth. Well, something must have been done wrong. Surely something must have been bad, because obviously God has not blessed him. Job's friends spent all their time. You can read through their discussions with Job. The presumption was that whenever all these calamities fell upon Job, that Job was under a curse from God, that Job was not only a sinner, he was a worse sinner than anybody else was, because all these terrible events were coming down around Job's head. So, healthy, prosperous people must be righteous, and poor, sick people must be wicked. So the disciples said, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now see, that being born blind poses a singular theological problem here. A man's living along in his lifetime, and slowly, as he, let's say, gets into his late 50s, because he got glaucoma, and they didn't know back then what glaucoma was, the man went blind. Well, we can analyze that and say, well, that terrible thing happened to that man because of his sins in his lifetime. But now here is this poor child who was born into the world and never saw from the time it was an infant. He's grown up in his parents' home. Now he's out here begging on the street or what have you. And he was born that way. Everybody knows him. Everybody knows he never saw. Well, then how do we account for his blindness? Well, maybe it was his parents. And that's what his disciples asked Jesus. And Jesus said, Neither has this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. Now, Jesus isn't saying that sickness, disease, and poverty, and so forth are not in the world because of sin. He is not saying that sin does not lead to these things. What he is saying is there is no direct connection between a man's affliction and some particular sin that this man has done. Nor to say that one of us in this congregation is blind means that we are a worse sinner than anyone else in the congregation who is not blind. Because it doesn't take much imagination, does it, to realize that someone who is blind may be a very good person, and someone who sees perfectly well may be quite wicked. This was the real dilemma that David was struggling with back in the 73rd Psalm, I believe, where he says, he said, my steps were almost gone, my feet had slipped. And he said, because I was envious at the prosperity of the wicked. He could not understand how men he knew who were wicked as the day is long were prospering, and how righteous men that he knew were suffering. And it was a real battle for him to understand it. Jesus dismisses all that in connection with this man. He said, this man is here in order that the glory of God might be manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, because the night comes when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And when he had finished saying this, he spat on the ground and made clay out of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. Just a little spit and saliva and dirt, makes clay, and makes a little poultice that he smears over the poor man's eyes. He said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And the man went, and he washed, and came seeing. Yesterday, well, on the way to the pool, they had to lead him by the hand so he could find his way there. He was blind. He went down to the pool, washed his eyes, and came away from the pool seeing. The neighbors, therefore, and they which had seen him that was born blind, said, isn't that the guy that sat here and begged? I mean, surely that's him, but this man can see. Others said, it's him. Some people said, no, he just looks like him. But the man said to himself, no, folks, I am the man. And they said to him, well, how were your eyes opened? And he answered and said, a man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went, and I washed, and I received sight. Then they said to him, well, where is he? And he said, I don't know. Well, this is really a fascinating passage in many ways, because there is not a hint of any knowledge on the man's part, any faith on his part, any belief in Jesus. He really didn't even know who Jesus was, except he heard the name, and that didn't mean a whole lot to him. He says, I was blind, I see, I don't know where he went. And they brought him to the Pharisees that had been before time blind. Now, it says in verse 14, and it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Now, you have to understand that this little statement here is the core of the problem. No one really cared very much, or would have minded. They would have probably thought it was a marvelous thing for Jesus simply to heal a man who was born blind. But, you see, healing is work. Even going to the trouble of, here's a man with a withered arm. He's just standing there with his arm withered, and you say to the man, stretch forth your arm. And he stretches it forth, and it becomes whole like the other one. This is a work. And you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath day, and so it was wrong somehow for Jesus to heal on the Sabbath day. Now, would you like to explain that to me? How on earth did they ever come to that conclusion? Now, I'm going to try to explain something here to you about a certain mindset that people have that relates very much to what I've been talking to you here and also to the Houston church about, having to do with the objectives of the church and with setting objectives for local churches and the things that churches are supposed to do. I've come to see, as a result of beginning to work on this program and looking at the churches at International and then looking back on the worldwide Church of God from which we came, that we always have, now, rules have their place. Rules are important, and rules are, the law of God is a set of rules, and they are very important to us and how we live our lives. The problem is that in certain situations, the law becomes an end to be served rather than a means to an end. Think about it. So is the law an end in itself to be served, or is the law a means to an end? It's in this sense, I think, that we should understand the statement that Christ is an end to the law. If you'll turn back to Romans, the 10th chapter, and keep your place in John, we'll come back to it. Romans, the 10th chapter, there's an interesting statement made. I'll begin reading in verse 1. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness, and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. They have tried to achieve righteousness by rules. And it won't work that way. Exceptions to the rules which you do find in the Bible. Every one of the subsequent judgments that are arrived at and the directions are all aimed at a goal, at an objective. And the objective is the retention and the salvation of the family unit. It is to hold families together. It is to formalize and to stabilize the relationship between a man and a woman who are going to have children for which they are going to be responsible. And so even though the original intent was one man, one woman for life, actually that was not the intent. That was the law, which was a rule, which was a means to an end, and the end was the stable family relationship. You don't just serve the law and in the process destroy stable family relationships. This was something we had a hard time getting through our heads years ago. That here was a family who had gotten a divorce years ago, had separated, the woman had gone and married another man, and they had children together and been living together for 15 years. Now they come to the church, to the ministry, and they're requesting baptism. Well, that divorce and subsequent remarriage was a sin. Therefore, the decision was made, this marriage that you're in right now is not binding, therefore it's a sin. Therefore, if you're going to be baptized and be God's people, you've got to split up and go be reconciled, if possible, I suppose, to this original husband, although the law forbade that. Nobody was thinking much about that. That was not an option under the law. And so on it went. So in other words, we were in the process of trying to serve the original rule. We were actually going contrary to what the purpose of the rule was. And that was to stabilize the family relationship so that parents will be responsible for their children. And you're faced with this incredible picture of ministers of Jesus Christ breaking up a family unit in order to serve a rule. Now, as I say, if you want the complete argument on this, read the article I wrote, Is There Life After Divorce, because it develops the concept much further. And the underlying concept on God's judgment is discussed in a sermon tape that I've given some time ago, which I think is a very important concept to understanding why it is that sometimes we have to make judgments on how to live after a law has been broken or an unusual circumstance to do with the law. It's not a difficult concept to understand, but when you are so rules dominated in your approach to administration of the church, you wind up sometimes doing a great deal of harm rather than being objective oriented. And then the rules, understanding the rules that God has given us, as being the means whereby the objectives are obtained. So that you will begin to see reflected in the CGI in the years and months ahead new guidelines for field churches that are going to be objectives-oriented rather than simply rules-oriented. And what rules there are will be rules for the purpose of reaching the objectives, not rules to be served in themselves and for no other reason than themselves. Now, coming back to John 9 and verse 14, it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Now, is healing a good work? Yeah, of course it is. Well, now, on the Sabbath day, you're not supposed to do any work, right? Well, right. Well, therefore, on the Sabbath day, you shouldn't even be doing a good work, because that's work. Therefore, to heal the sick on the Sabbath day is wrong. Now, intuitively, you know better than that. But you can get so habituated to thinking in terms of the obedience to the rules beyond merely as lights to your feet, but as objects of veneration to be served, that you can actually begin to do real harm to people, which God, of course, never intended to happen, or fail to do real good to people, which was intended. And Jesus asked the question of these same people. He said, now, tell me, which one of you people here, if he has an ox or an ass, will not go out to the barn, untie this poor animal, and lead him down and have him drink, and lead him back and tie him up on the Sabbath day? Anybody want to raise your hand? Which of you won't do that? Well, of course they would do that. He says, you will go down there, and you'll water an animal. You'll untie him, and you'll water him. Now, why in the world, he asked, shouldn't I untie this poor person who's been bound by this illness for all these years on the Sabbath day? Well, we have a rule to cover that, the animal. We don't have a rule that allow you to do what you did. It's about the only explanation you can come up with. Jesus broke the rule. Because you see, down through generations, they had developed an elaborate set of rules to explain the rules, which explains the rules, to the extent to which so many aspects of human life were covered, that once again, having forgotten what God's objective was. Well, the Pharisees asked this fellow again, how did you receive your sight? He said to them, well, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I can see. Now the Pharisees said, this man is not of God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath day. Others said, well, how can a man that's a sinner do miracles like that? And there was a huge division among them. This man can't be of God because he broke the rule. Oh, where in the Bible is it said? Where in the Bible is the rule that says you can't heal on the Sabbath day? I never read that anywhere, did you? Well, what rule could he possibly have been breaking? The only one I can figure out is their rule. They had created. They had decided it should be so. Keep your place here and turn back to Mark, the 2nd chapter. Mark chapter 2. And I'll begin reading verse 23. It came to pass that as he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees said, why do they do on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? Now, wait. Where is it in the law that it says you're not supposed to pluck ears of corn on the Sabbath day? Where is it? You know, you're walking through a field, here's a grain. Where does the law say you're not to reach down and grab hold of an ear of corn, pluck it off into your hand, and maybe work it through your fingers and munch on it as you go on down the road? Anybody know where that scripture is? Well, it's not there. Of course it's not there. There's nothing like that in the Bible. But, you know, going out and reaping a harvest in the field is obviously work. And you don't do work on the Sabbath day. Well, no. Well, what if I reap half a harvest? No, well, that's wrong. Well, what if I go out and I reap a bushel? No, that's wrong. What about half a bushel? That's wrong. What about a cup? That's wrong. What about a handful? Well, that's all right. It's in such rule-making that and line drawing that all sorts of questions arise that really don't need to arise at all. It was their rule that said it was not lawful. It was not the law of God that said that. And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he had need and was hungry? He and they that were with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and did eat the showbread which is not lawful to eat, but for the priest, and he gave to them that were with him. Didn't you ever read about that? Now, why do you suppose Christ put that in here? Well, isn't it to show, is an illustration that what David did was not wrong. Or, if wrong, was justified, and therefore God would not condemn him for it. Isn't that the reason why it's in here? Otherwise, why would the thing be here? Okay, the law says, here's this showbread. No one but the priest may eat this. Well, David and his men showed up there. They were hard bestead. They were hungry. They hadn't eaten in a long time. And human lives really were at risk over not having had anything to eat. It was important that they be able to be fed. And they asked the priest for bread. And the bread, he says, I'm sorry. He said, there's nothing here but the showbread. And he said, however, he was ready to take the showbread away. But he and David sat there and worked their way through a rationalization of why it was okay for his young men, since they'd been on the road, they hadn't been around women or anything, to be defiled that way, and therefore they could eat the bread. So they sat there and they rationalized their way around the law, the rules, to justify eating the showbread. And then here comes Christ and says, their rationalization of it was right. That's the point. That there are times when ordinary, day in, day out, human needs can actually override the ceremonial aspects of clean, unclean, the laws and so forth that God has put down here for time. Why? Well, because of what he's going to develop a concept in this little passage which explains so much. He goes on to say, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Oh. The law was made for man, and not man for the law. The rules were made for man, and not man for the rules. In other words, the rules, the law of God, the commandment of God, and the Sabbath of God, all these things were made to take man to an objective. And the objective is the thing. The law was made to serve that objective by being a light to a man's feet, by helping him to know who God is, by helping him to understand how to treat his neighbor, how to love God, how to love his fellow man, how to deal with life situations, how to be responsible for the damage that you cause another person, which the liability laws of the Bible deal with. And so on it goes. All these laws are there to teach, to explain, to add knowledge, to help you grow. They are not there for you to put on you can write them on the walls and so forth, but they are not there for you to bow down before them and worship them. You worship God, you do not worship the law. You worship God and Christ his Son. You look forward to the kingdom of God. You work for the kingdom of God. You sacrifice to be in the kingdom of God. You do not sacrifice to the law or for the law. It's maybe a little difficult concept in a way to understand, but it's important for us to understand. I believe in the law. I preach the law. I try to obey the law in my life, but I do not worship the law. I worship God. The law is God's attempt or his way of revealing to me a way of life. It is a means to an end, not an end within itself. The Pharisee said, this man is not of God because he doesn't keep the Sabbath day. Who said so? They said so. Did the fact that they said so mean that it was true? They said he didn't keep the Sabbath day. Did that mean he didn't keep the Sabbath day? Hardly. What it meant was he didn't keep it their way. No man can be of God if he doesn't keep the Sabbath day our way. That's essentially what they were saying. Well, other people had this question. Now, I want you to tell me something, folks. He wants to know this. How is it possible for a lawbreaker, a sinner, someone who will walk right across the law of God, to heal a man who was born blind? Can you explain that to me? Well, they said to the blind man again, what do you say of him that opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that had been blind and received his sight. They didn't even believe it. They said, oh, well, you're probably lying to us. The miracle didn't take place. So they called his parents in. And they asked him, saying, is this your son who was born blind, and now he sees? His parents said, we know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. So you're stuck with those two things. But by what means he now sees, we don't know. Who opened his eyes, we don't know. He is of age. Ask him. He can speak for himself. Interesting, the way in which they go about this. Listen, though, to this explanation of their answer. These words spoke his parents because they were afraid of the Jews, because the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that Jesus was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. He is out of the support group. He is out of the family. He is out of the place where he would go to hear the law read. He would not even be able to go there. He is cut off from the religious community, all the services of the religious community, even the welfare type of services that you and I would think of in our world. He's cut off. There is a serious matter to be cut off from the synagogue. Not quite like being cast out of a local Methodist church and being able to go to a different Methodist church or a Presbyterian or a Baptist. Not the same. Therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. And they went to him that was blind and said to him, give God the praise. We know this man is a sinner. Let's go give him credit for your healing. Let's give God the credit for it. He's just a sinner. He answered and said, look, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. Now there's a lot there. That's an honest answer. You know, I don't know anything about the man's life. I don't know how he's lived. I don't know what he's done. I can't tell you any of that. One thing I know, I was blind, now I can see. Then they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Wait a minute. Wasn't that asked already? If you're in court, the attorney would say, object, answer, ask, and answer. Anyway, he answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Why do you want to hear it again? Are you going to be his disciples too? Was it sarcasm in this? This fellow by this time is fed up to here with the whole thing. I mean, here he has been all of his life born blind, and blind, dependent upon everybody, other people for everything, wandering around in a total black darkness all of his life, knowing everything only by touch, by feel, by smell, by taste, by texture. It's all that he knew anything, and by sound. Now he can see. And now he's having some nitpickers pull him apart because of the man or whoever the man was or the day on which it was done that he's allowed to see. He's getting testy about the whole thing. Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, we're Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he came from. The man answered and said, why, here is a marvelous thing. You don't know anything about him. You don't know where he even came from. And yet he has opened my eyes. Isn't it amazing? The sarcasm must have dripped from his voice when he made those statements. Now we know that God hears not sinners. But if any man be a worshiper of God and does his will, him God hears. Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? When have you men ever heard of anything like this? If this man were not of God, he couldn't do anything. They answered unto him, you were altogether born in sin. You're going to teach us anything? And they cast him out. Threw him out of the synagogue. Excommunicated him. Cut him off from all of the family, friends, people he knew, and where he had been. Why? Because he refused to denounce or to deny Jesus, whom he hardly even knew. It's amazing. Anyway, they cast him out. Jesus heard that, and when he had found him, he actually went to the man because he knew that had to be a difficult thing for him. He said, do you believe on the Son of God? He answered, said, well, who is he, my Lord, that I may believe in him? He didn't even know. He says, he didn't even know what Jesus looked like. From the time that Jesus fixed his eyes and sent him to wash, he had never clapped eyes on him. He did not even know what he looked like. And he said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said, you have both seen him, and he it is that's talking with you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I am come into this world that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind. There was a reason why he chose this thing. A reason why he picked this man out. A reason why he healed a man born blind, saved a man born crippled. It was to make this point. I'm come into the world that they that don't see, who are blind, might come to see, and that those people who see might be made blind. If indeed those men in the synagogue who cast this poor guy out, those men in the synagogue who continually and vehemently denied Christ and refused to recognize him, even as a good man, even as a prophet, they weren't being called upon to recognize him as the Messiah or as the Christ. They could have said he's a good man. They could say he's a prophet. They could say, well, God healed through him. They could have said a lot of things. But they wouldn't. They were blind. And some of the Pharisees that were with him heard these words, and they said, are we blind also? You say, you really mean we're blind? And Jesus said, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But you say you see, therefore your sin remains. If you're blind, if you really didn't know, God would not hold you accountable for it. If you guys, you men, you say you see, therefore your sin remains. It is, isn't it, a really sobering passage here to think about, and shocking in its implications of people who were so hidebound to a set of rules. Their ideas about God's law, not about the law of God in its most basic form, in its objective form, that is in the form of the law which is designed to achieve the objective of a right way of life and living. but in their own set of rules they had built up around the law, blinded themselves completely to the objective that God had for men, which is to alleviate human suffering, that the blind might see, that the lame might walk, that the poor might have the right way of life pointed out to them and might be helped to overcome their adversity. These are the things that God had in store for man, that God wanted for man to do. It's a beautiful lesson, folks, right out of the testimony of John, that he gave it to us to help us to understand the things that Jesus taught. I'm not sure I understand the question. We're out of time. Maybe we can chat about that afterwards. We'll take a break now.